Welcome back to Heroclix Clash New Player Orientation. Today, we will be discussing Chapter 4 of the Comprehensive Rulebook. Chapter 4 of the Comprehensive Rulebook is Game Setup. Once players assemble their starting forces, game setup begins with several steps that must be followed in order by all players. 4.1 Step 1. Reveal starting forces and establish first player. Greet your opponent. All players reveal their starting forces and turn those characters, including those of their sideline, to their starting lines chosen for this game. All players establish if their team is a theme team. 4.1a Effects while establishing theme team. If a player has multiple effects that occur while establishing a theme team, they may apply them in the order of their choice. 4.1b Determining first player. Each player rolls 2d6 and adds their initiative bonus. Re-roll any ties. The player with the highest result chooses if they want to be the first player, or if the player with the next highest result will be the first player. From the first player, the next player clockwise around the table is the second player. If there are more than two players, the one after that is the third player, and so on. For any simultaneous effects that need ordering before the first turn begins, the first player is considered the active player. 4.2 Step 2. Choose map in starting areas. The second player picks the map to play on. Then the first player chooses which starting area to use. For most maps, the starting areas of the map are the map edges, but some older maps may use purple bordered areas to denote starting areas. 4.2a Starting areas. For a two-player game on a 16 by 16 square map, the first player chooses an edge of the map to use as their starting area, and the second player uses the opposite map edge as theirs. For larger size maps or games with more than two players, use a map with purple bordered areas to denote starting areas. 4.3 Step 3 Set up characters and other game elements. The first player places all their characters and other applicable game elements in their starting area. Terrain, including objects, are also placed at this time in squares outside of the starting area. Any other game elements that don't go on the map are placed in the applicable play area. Each subsequent player then does the same. 4.3a Expanding starting areas. In some cases, a player's starting force may not fit in their chosen starting area. If so, the player will expand their starting areas. The expansion of the starting area is only to be used when a player has filled all possible squares in their starting area without placing all of their figures. When placing game elements, the largest multi-based game elements must be placed first, and then the next largest, etc., until you are placing single-based figures. Multi-base characters must be placed in such a way that as much of their base as possible is in the starting area. For 16 by 16 square maps, a player must attempt to fit all game elements along their starting edge, regardless of how they personally want to set up their force. The player must fit in all of their game elements as best as possible. If a player can fit all their starting game elements into their starting area in any possible configuration, they may not expand their starting area. A player can only expand their starting area if, after completely filling in their starting area as fully as possible, they still have game elements left to be placed. 4.3b How to expand your starting area. For 16 by 16 square maps, the player will expand their starting area by one row and place the remaining game elements. If after expanding the player still can't fit their remaining game elements, they continue adding rows and placing game elements one row at a time until all their game elements can be placed. For larger maps, the starting area instead expands along the shortest map edge it occupies. adding one column of squares as deep as the printed starting area to the starting area one at a time until either the starting area has expanded the minimum amount to fit the player's starting force, or the entire map edge has been filled by that player's starting area. If the map edge has been filled, the starting area then begins to expand in the same manner as a 16 by 16 square map until the starting force fits. 4.3c Expansion Limits. Starting areas may never overlap with another starting area. If this would occur, then the starting area can no longer be expanded. Any game elements remaining that are unable to be placed are KO'd and scored. 4.3d Setting up starting game elements if expanding starting areas. If the first player expanded their starting area, then the second player must use the same expanded starting area when placing their game elements on the map. For example, if the first player expanded their 2 rows up, the second player is also expanded 2 rows up. If it was the second player that required expansion, after the second player places their game elements, the first player must then reposition their own game elements with regard to their now larger starting area. The player may then choose to leave game elements in their originally placed squares, so long as no game elements that can't be placed in the starting area are within the expanded starting area. During setup, players must use the expanded starting areas for rules and effects that refer to the starting area, such as special objects needing to be placed 5 squares away from a starting area. In rare cases, you may not be able to place things as far away from starting areas as required, in which case you place them as far away as possible. Once the game has begun, any reference to starting areas only applies to the squares along the map's edge that players started on, including during any at the beginning of the game triggers. 4.4 Step 4 Resolve beginning of the game triggered effects. Before the first player takes their first turn, both players resolve any effects that trigger at the beginning of the game. Effects that trigger during the beginning of the game step only get one opportunity to trigger and resolve. Game elements with such effects must be on your force and on the map during the special step in order to trigger and resolve. If a game element has an effect that triggers during the beginning of the game step, but enters the game after the step has passed, that effect will not trigger. If a game element has an effect triggered during the beginning of the game, and that game element leaves the map before its effect resolves, the effect will still resolve. See 8.1f. 4.5 Step 5 Begin the game and take the first turn. Starting with the first player, each player alternates taking turns until the game is over.